Sumeru's arrival has long since been behind us. I've been playing this game for 826 straight days now. And as we approach patch 3.4 with each passing banner, with each passing step we take into the forests and deserts of Sumeru, there's this one notion, a question that haunts my mind every now and then. Why is Sumeru so underwhelming? In order to answer that question, we'll go into a retrospective of all the regions of Teyvat leading to this point. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, YouTube. It's your Slime King Dejima Man, and welcome to a brand new video, baby! It's been a long time, hasn't it, huh? So let's start from the very beginning, examining the landscapes, the archons, the quests, and their overall implications to each region. Shall we begin? Mondstat as a region, despite being relatively bland as compared to Inazuma or Sumeru, was a novel experience. It's obvious, comparing this region to any other, that the sweeping plains of Mondstat that stretched to as far as Tignari could spread his shots falls in comparison. However, this was the first time you took a step into the vast world of Teyvat. And such a retrospecting along those lines cannot happen because there is none to compare to at that point. Similarly, the story, while absolutely generic and tropey in all senses, was our first introduction to the world's lore. Our first encounter in the game was Venti as his eyes meet the Valen, with Forlorn as his old friend Coldly flies away and rejects him. He was a god that wanted freedom, and as such his rule was all but non-existent, unlike our love for the game at the point. He battled many things that was unbeknownst to us. However, the storytelling still fell short, as it clinged to many tropes. We were mysteriously thrust into this land as the chosen one that could seemingly purify the corrupt, the Valen, and his Coom. We meet various people along the way, and through the power of friendship, we managed to defeat the Valen and purify him. This, paired with a butchered pacing and one of the worst boss fights in the game, kind of leaves a sour taste in all our mouths. However, if anything, the glimpse of La Sinora saved us all, and the grass, the expectation of the grass being greener, of a better story, would be there since the game was just beginning. There were too many mysteries yet to unfold. Non-gacha gamers also fell into a trap, as the monetization was not all that apparent just yet, and exploring the world was just genuinely fun. There was no backdrop of grinding primos for the next banner. This was the era of innocence. And that innocence continued on over to the next region we will visit. I can never forget the first time I ever climbed Sengyun Peak. How the hell do you say this? Okay, we're freaking Googling it. Chengyun. Sencho! Oh yeah, that makes sense. That makes all the goddamn sense in the world. Okay, who cares if the background's different? I'm gonna jump. I can never forget the first time I ever climbed Chengyun Peak. As I hear the chords of the piano permeate through my entire being, mountains enveloped in the clouds, a long and arduous end to reach the peak. It evoked a sense of serenity after accomplishment, a brief repose to the exploration and bemusement. And to this day, this is my favorite moment in all of Genshin Impact. It held such a fond feeling of bemusement and wonder that couldn't be replicated by any other region after it. Liyue's landscapes was a stark departure from Mondstat. Suddenly towering mountains in Minglin intimidated you. Guyon's stone forest archipelago-like features made you wonder what kind of battles took place in it. And Liyue was that much more lively as compared to the country town of Mondstat. In terms of Archon Quest, while Venti was relatable in many ways, the introduction of the Geo Archon Zhongli was equally as good, but in the opposite of ways. He was the exact antithesis to Venti, as the oldest Archon emboldened in battle and generations of wisdom. It was a mere fact that he actually felt like a god, as opposed to Venti that drew people to him. Though his role in the story can be questioned at times, because despite having all that knowledge, he still made it feel like he was a fool for, number one, letting the Fatui do as they please. This was unbecoming of his nature as a Geo Archon, simply because the way he was portrayed and his actions did not actually match. And number two, bargaining with them in the context that he was trusting Liyue's people. Now this point feels a little less appalling, as a sudden realization of Liyue without a god to prosper is a good idea. However, the execution of the story leaves a little more to be desired, as again the pacing was a little too fast, and Zhongli's role in the Archon quest was too little to have the desired effect of actually relating with his ideals. And then we have Child, who, for all intents and purposes, is a genocidal goddamn maniac, under the guise of a sweet-hearted older brother trying to make ends meet for his big family in Snezhnaya as a fake toy factory worker. The mere fact that we forgave him after all of that, during his character quest, it felt like nothing even happened. After all that he's done towards Liyue, makes it feel like the traveler merely accepts what the world is happening around them, as opposed to them actually having the power to change things. Of course, as Liyue and Mondstat were part of the opening package deal of Genshin Impact, it goes without saying that everything we experienced all the way towards the end of the respective chapters thus far were still pretty novel, and the expectation of being better was still there. But little did we know that it would take one whole year before our expectations can be put to place, and for most people, that whole long year was enough to burn them out before we even reached the next region, Inazuma. This was a years-long wait, and as such, the same novelty we've talked about with the past two regions has wholly and emphatically eradicated. This was the time in our lives where we hated Genshin. Genshin was dying. There's no new content. Before we reach Inazuma, there would be nothing left of this player base. Everything was stale. I hate my life. I hate everything about Genshin Impact. However, when Inazuma did arrive, what was there was merely an abundance of hype and a sign of things to come. Inazuma fully embraced the idea of exploring multiple islands as opposed to one huge chunk of land mass. Now, areas were segregated by the vast ocean, and each island had its own unique theme and explorational niche, and ultimately, identity. Despite the gap between regions, Hoyoverse managed to give us such a novel experience once again, and our expectations were wholly met. From Narukami Island to Kanazuka to Yashiori Island, everything felt surreal, as each place provided different contexts, feels, and atmospheres. Exploration was driven up one notch higher as more and more complex ideas came into fruition. The addition of electrograms, long winding quest chains like purifying the sacred tree, and the overall complexity of the terrains provided a much needed breath of fresh air to the then palpable staleness growing within Genshin Impact. We were Tignari in a mushroomless land, and Inazuma came on us with mushrooms. The Archon in the quest, however, was a whole different can of mushrooms. Raiden Shogun's introduction to us all was of a stern dictator that got what she wanted, especially through the Vision Hunt decree. She posed fear in everyone's hearts, but still everyone had to respect her. However, as the story progressed, it was shown that that wasn't the true Electro Archon after all, and that A, who was hiding somewhere deep inside of Raiden Shogun's brain in a little samsara bubble, was the real one, and her personality was the polar opposite of the puppet known as Raiden Shogun. This, in my opinion, was a huge missed opportunity to showcase an Archon that was truly morally wrong but stuck to her guns and stuck to her own ideals. Raiden was such a stark difference, a stark departure to other Archons that it made her appealing and unique. However, what they instead chose to do was to present her true self as a simple, uwu, simpable waifu that you can enjoy in her dating simulator character quest. Blah. As for the quest itself, it's even more horribly placed and paced than the previous two chapters. We went from Inazuma City shenanigans to Scaramouche Signora shenanigans to the Civil War to then finally defeating Raiden Shogun with, you guessed it, the power of friendship. It's this constant shifting of tones in the story, coupled with the fact that we never got enough time to get emotionally invested into any of the characters, any of the storylines, that left us all disappointed and frankly pessimistic of what was to come. Despite all of this, Inazuma was swallowed whole by the hype generated by its player base. The 2.0 livestream is still the most viewed livestream event in all of Genshin Impact's existence. It's a combination of wanting more content after the initial burst when Genshin Impact released, and Inazuma being wholly equivalent to Japan. Genshin Impact is an anime game, and then you introduce the region that is the soul of anime culture, and it's a no-brainer. Everyone will be more hyped, everyone will be more invested. And I haven't even talked about Kamisato Ayaka, a unit showcased in Genshin's beta, a character that was being saved for by literally millions of F2P frogs since the start of the game. You combine all of that, and what you get is a new region that would truly get gobbled up by the masses. The year-long wait after consuming Inazuma content was inevitable, however. The cycle of burnout was bound to repeat itself. But what this region did differently, however, was having expansions every patch to every 2 patches or so. Serai Island was released, Watatsumi was released, Tsurumi was released, and eventually Enkanomiya. This drip feed of content would become the staple of how Genshin Impact introduced its regions. However, with this comes a price. Time-lock quests such as Tatarasuna became more and more commonplace, and suddenly you couldn't play the game when you wanted to. You couldn't finish everything the day you wanted to, and you did not have access to all the content during day 1 releases. But whether you like it or not, it works, as the burnout and the staleness in our mouths were reduced, and the wait for Sumeru was that much less agonizing. Sumeru, for all intents and purposes for me, was underwhelming as all frick. It could have been that at this point, I have been playing this game for 2 years and nothing quite gets me the same level of excitement I had with the previous regions. Or that Genshin Impact's formula for success had probably grown stale. Nevertheless, my hype for this new region was all but non-existent, and you can tell that for the player base, at least basing on live stream statistics comparing the 2.0 live stream to the 3.0 live stream, that this is the case for some 200,000 people as well. This was just another drop in the bucket of Genshin patches for me. It didn't help that the new character, despite being a new element, despite being Tignari, felt underwhelming to me. But we'll get into that later. First, let's talk about Sumeru's landscape. We are introduced to Gandaraville, and what we see is nothing short of ordinary. Don't get me wrong, I don't hate Sumeru's terrains nor its atmosphere, but I just can't shake off the feeling that we've seen this somewhere before. It's a mixture of terrains from Liyue, Mondstat, Inazuma in a lush forest backdrop. The terrain grows more and more complex, for better or for worse. New mechanics such as the powers of Kusava, Tri-Lakshana creatures, and allowing you to close gaps with the hook mechanics make great tools for exploration and puzzles. But somehow all of it feels shallow, hollow, or even empty. Whenever I stop and appreciate the scenery, there's nothing that quite strikes me and strokes me in the same way that Cheng-Yun Peak strokes me the first time I ever reached its peak. Everything becomes just another puzzle, just another chest. It was as if I was merely walking from point A to point B to reach an objective. The Aranara quests were quite tedious, which definitely did not help. The deserts of Sumeru were much of the same, but worse. As there are not enough pulley points to latch onto to close the gaps at times, and it made it seem apparent that you needed either to use Yelan or Sayu or both to traverse the landscape. Exploring the pyramids, however, provided a much more novel experience that made me question just what kind of technology Khaenri'an times actually had. The puzzles were rarely obtuse and were easily solvable before frustration could ever set in. I'm looking at you, Golden Archipelago 2.0. And of course, when it comes back to the soundtrack, Port Ormos is a banger. It's obvious as Genshin Impact continues to live on, regions will become more complex, and perhaps the stagnation I felt inside of Sumeru could change, because Archon Quest in Sumeru did just that.
When I woke up, I was riding in the flower carriage. I just had a dream. I dreamed it was my birthday. In the dream, the Knight of Flowers and his retainers found me. Oh, Archon, we finally found you. The people can't wait to meet you. The Sub-Zero's festival began, and everyone smiled as they gathered around me. Finally, I got back on the carriage and waved goodbye. When I woke up, I was riding in a flower carriage. It was my birthday. Happy birthday, Nahida.
Sumeru's Archon and its corresponding quest was nothing short of objectively better than anything we've experienced so far, and the one reason for this was pacing. Now that can be a double-edged sword, and that rings true here. I'll explain. As a result of longer quest lines and a more thorough characterization of characters, we get more depth and insight into each one, and we get to sample the inner workings of the Akasha, Academia, and Irminsul. However, the opposite side of this coin makes it so that we have to go through long-winded dialogue that can feel exhausting. And by this time, I know that you know that Hoyoverse likes to structure their stories, and it's just paragraph upon paragraph of almost all drivel. However, at least the structure is in place that adds gravity to the entire situation we find ourselves in. Now that is to say, despite having good pacing, after the first Archon quest, I found myself to be less and less interested in the succeeding chapters. The premise was interesting, but yet again, the story played itself to be blander than a plain loaf of bread. Digestible, but you'd rather add spreads, much like how Tignari blows all his spreads on one toast. Nida, however, is the most interesting Archon among the bunch. The youngest Archon shows an inquisitive nature, being born post-Archon War. She poses questions about humanity that interests me, and her whole entire characterization, the way she was treated by the Academia, and her realizations by the end of the quest were quite interesting. Dottore as the Fatui foil in all of this was far better than Signora Childer's Scaramouche combined, with a storyline of trying to make their own god in Sumeru, and Scaramouche's focal role in the story, even if it just turned out to become another redemption story by the end, was just far better executed than any of its predecessors. This just shows the potential of Genshin's lore, and though I do have to say Scaramouche's role in Sumeru and his redemption is eerily similar to Child's role in Liyue, The difference here is, even if Scaramouche was the villain, he had a proper redemption story which Shao did not have, and it showed us that he truly wanted a change. And this time the Traveler was very reluctant and still is very reluctant to forgive him. At least that shows a little bit of improvement in Hoyoverse's storytelling. Now if only Hoyoverse could write their stories actually a little bit better, that would be nice too. Finally, now we can talk about Dendro, and this region's biggest impact in Genshin Impact. Dendro was the newest exciting thing to come to Genshin's combat system since its inception. Naturally, people were excited, and I was too, for all but 5 minutes into the patch. We'll delve slightly into meta talk here, as it goes without saying, if we talk about the new element, meta is bound to be brought up. The problem with Dendro's release was twofold in that regard. One, the spearhead for this new element was Tignari, a standard banner character in an event banner disguise. He was particularly unhyped, average, and mostly unappealing to most, except for me because I hella love shagging mushrooms. But his limited role as a Dendro unit as compared to what Naida can do now is staggering enough. The team choices at the start of 3.0 felt incomplete for Dendro. Number 2, the Dendro supports were all trash. Kale did not have enough Dendro applications to sustain any other team but Quicken, and Dendro MC, while being good, required insane amounts of VR, but would only be slotted in because of Dendro application. Aside from that application, they had no other utility like healing or even just doing damage. It didn't help that in some teams running Hyper Bloom or Quick Bloom, Dendro MC was just unable to sustain enough Dendro to make the reactions work. And thus, you had introduced great new reactions in Dendro, but none of that actually mattered because none of the actual characters could fulfill their potential at launch. Of course, none of that is a problem now with the arrival of Naida, but still the damage for me had been done at the start of Sumeru. The excitement waned, and Dendro simply existed, just like any other element. Even now, Dendro still lacks a little bit more variety in Dendro supports to run 2 teams in the Abyss. It's that dissatisfaction that has wholly turned my excitement for Dendro upside down its frickin' face. But don't get me wrong, with all the experimental Dendro teams with Yaimiko as a driver, Kuki Hyper Bloom, Toma Burgeons, Dendro is definitely a fun element. However, I never really tried most of those teams simply because I knew Naida would bring something to the table that would complete them. And that fleeting discomfort is what truly rubbed me the wrong way of how Sumeru was released. Alright, I feel like I talked about Sumeru more so in detail than any other region thus far, but that's because as you play this game longer, the more you fall out of that love, that honeymoon phase. And then when you reminisce, fondly or non-fondly, of the times predating the region we are in now, the qualms we have today get less and less exacerbated. But it's quite interesting to see how I feel as this video's curtain come to a close. As I've played this game 826 days straight, I've come to realize that the more I play Genshin, the less actual fun I have, but the baseline remains the same. As I first stepped into Mondstat, the peak was very high. Everything was fun. But when you venture deeper into the regions of Teyvat, that fun slowly dips back down and becomes criticism. It's that brimming hope of what this game could be, and yet isn't. There's actually many more things I did want to talk about that I didn't talk about in this video, like the events, Dragon Spine, the Chasm, Enkanomiya, the TCG, but simply put, they aren't part of the reasons why I remember the regions in the first place. But do let me know down in the comments below whether or not you'd be interested in seeing a video on that or more videos like this. Or you can come at me over at twitch.tv/TheGmaman, where I stream Genshin almost every day. Come hear some Kokomi moans. I promise you it's real, please don't leave. Over at my Discord, the Slime Kingdom, this is our parting. Farewell.